Ever driven down a Forest Service road here in Alberta
Yeah.
and kind of wondered, wait, am I even on a highway right now?
That's a good question.
Turns out you might be,
Yeah.
legally speaking, at least. We're going deep into Alberta's Traffic Safety Act,
Yeah.
specifically like the nitty-gritty of the law as of May 16th, 2024.
Right.
We're trying to uncover the stuff that maybe we don't think about every day, but actually impacts all of us when we're behind the wheel.
Yeah, and I think that's what we're trying to do here, going beyond just like, okay, this is the law. Like, the sign says this, but like, why is that the law? And then, like, what happens if you break it? And what are some of the nuances that people might not realize?
Totally. Because who actually sits around reading through the revised statutes of Alberta for fun?
Not many people.
Like, that's why we're here. But you mentioned highways, and honestly, that's where I got tripped up, right?
Right.
Because in my head, it's those big multi-lane, like, stretches of pavement.
Yeah, yeah.
But it's not just that, is it?
No, and that's the thing. Like, the act is very broad with its definition of highway. Like, it could be a lane, an alley, those Forest Service roads we talked about. And so, like, that can determine things like speed limits or even how an accident's handled, depending on whether something is defined as a highway or not.
So just knowing if something is a highway versus, like, private property, that's actually crucial.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. But it also made me wonder, like, who gets to decide on these rules?
Right.
Like, is it all just, like, the big provincial government and that's it?
Well, so it is provincial legislation, right? So the Traffic Safety Act is provincial, but there is an element of, like, I guess you would say, like, power sharing. So we think about the province, we think about, like, the government when it comes to driving, and the Registrar of Motor Vehicle Services. So the registry, they have a lot of say. They set a lot of the standards. They handle driver's licenses, that kind of thing. But did you know that, like, your local city council can actually have a role too?
Wait, really?
Yeah.
I thought they were just, like, worried about filling potholes and, like, giving out parking tickets.
They do that too. But so under the act, municipalities can actually create bylaws. So that speed bump you see in a neighborhood or a resident-only parking sign, things like that, that could actually be a decision made by your local council.
Fascinating.
Yeah.
So it's like this weird chain of command, even for just our roads.
Right, yeah.
Okay. But what about when things go wrong, specifically with, like, people's licenses?
Right.
Like, what are some scenarios where, I don't know, maybe your license could get suspended or even, like, completely canceled?
So the Act outlines a number of situations where this could happen. Medical reasons are a big one. So if, let's say, a doctor reports that you have a medical condition that makes your driving unsafe, the registrar might have to step in. Of course, there's also things like driving under the influence or failing to maintain proper insurance. But we're gonna get into those more in depth a little bit later.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
But let's talk about the insurance for a second, because I feel like a lot of people, they don't realize how seriously the act takes driving without insurance.
Yeah, it's a big deal.
It's not just like, oh, you get a little ticket.
All right.
This is a big deal.
Yeah, this is like hefty fines, potential license suspension. They could even seize your vehicle. The act basically gives the registrar the power to cancel your vehicle registration until you can prove that you're financially responsible again.
Oh, yeah, no, that's a headache nobody wants.
Yeah.
And speaking of headaches, I know that the act has gotten really specific in recent years, especially about impaired driving.
Yeah.
So what are those immediate roadside sanctions we hear about?
Okay, so
How do they actually work?
yeah. So these sanctions, they were introduced relatively recently, and they're meant to be like very immediate and very impactful, right? So they're targeting the impairment, not just being over the legal limit necessarily. So even small amounts of alcohol or drugs, if you are found to have those in your system, you can be given these sanctions.
So it's not just about blowing over that .08 anymore.
Exactly. So let's say you're stopped and the officer has reasonable grounds to suspect that you've been consuming alcohol. Maybe you're not legally over the limit, but they can still issue a 3-day license suspension and a $200 fine right then and there.
Oh, wow.
And on top of that, they can have your vehicle towed and you have to pay for it.
Oh, man. Those immediate consequences are,
Yeah.
they definitely make you think twice. But do they apply to everyone the same? Or are there differences depending on, like, I don't know, how long you've been driving, for example?
Yeah, that's a great point. So the act differentiates between novice drivers, commercial drivers, and then like your regular class 5. So novice drivers, of course, being newer to the road, face much stricter rules. So for them, Even having a blood alcohol content between 0.00 and 0.08, so even below the legal limit, could result in a 30-day suspension and vehicle seizure.
Wow.
Yeah.
So it makes sense, right? Like they have less experience.
They
They
do.
shouldn't be messing around. Okay. What about people who drive for a living, though?
Right.
Like the commercial drivers.
Yeah.
Are they under even more scrutiny?
Oh, absolutely. So consider this. Commercial drivers have a zero tolerance policy for alcohol.
Wow.
So a first-time offense with any alcohol detected, even a tiny bit, can lead to a 3-day license suspension. They could seize the vehicle, fines, and to get their license back, they might have to, go through mandatory education programs.
Wow.
Yeah,
It really seems like the act, like, draws a line in the sand when it comes to those commercial vehicles.
for sure.
Okay. But let's change gears just a little bit here
Okay.
and talk about another type of driving that I feel like has a lot of misconceptions around it. Off-roading.
Yeah.
Like, I'm imagining there are still rules even if you're, like, miles away from any paved road.
Oh, yeah,
Yeah.
for sure. And the act is, again, very broad in its definition of off-highway vehicle. We're talking dirt bikes, ATVs, snowmobiles, those little pocket bikes even, right?
Right.
And a lot of people think that, once you're off the beaten path, you can just kind of do what you want. But that's not always the case.
No, it's not a free-for-all in the wilderness.
No, not at all.
Okay, so what are some specific rules that you think maybe people would be surprised about when it comes to off-roading, especially here in Alberta? Like, we have so much open space.
We do, yeah. One thing that trips people up is the difference between private and public land. So if you're on your own property, you don't actually need a driver's license, registration, or insurance for your off-highway vehicle.
Oh, okay.
But as soon as you step off your property, let's say you go onto your neighbor's land, even with their permission, now we're talking about public land, and those highway rules apply.
So even if I'm just, like, puttering around on my dirt bike on a friend's farm, like, I need to be following the same rules as if I'm, like, out on a main road.
Exactly. Unless that land is, specifically designated for off-highway vehicle use, you have to treat it as if it's any other public roadway. And that includes wearing a helmet. The helmet has to meet certain safety standards that are outlined in the Act.
Oh, okay. Speaking of safety, what about accidents that happen off-road?
Right.
Like, are the reporting requirements the same as with regular vehicles?
That's a good question. There are some nuances there. So technically, let's say you're backing your ATV into your garage, you hit something. You're probably not required to file any formal report. But if there's any injury involved, or if the accident occurs on, let's say, again, someone else's property, or if another vehicle is involved, then yeah, you absolutely have to report it.
So always better to be safe than sorry, and at least, like, exchange information just in case.
Exactly.
Okay. But let's get back to those commercial vehicles for a moment,
Okay.
because I know that they have a whole other layer of regulations that they have to
They do.
So what would you say are some of the key differences between how the Act looks at commercial versus regular vehicles?
I would say, in a nutshell, it's the permits. So commercial vehicles, often they need special permits to do certain things that you and I, with our regular vehicles, don't have to worry about. So that could be hauling oversized loads, transporting hazardous materials, things like that, or like exceeding certain weight limits for their vehicles. And these permits, they aren't just a formality either. They come with specific conditions and restrictions that the drivers have to follow.
And I'm guessing that not getting those permits could lead to more than just a slap on the wrist.
Oh, yeah. We're talking fines that can be in the thousands of dollars. They could potentially even seize the vehicle. And then on top of the permits, there's the inspection process. So commercial vehicles have to undergo inspections much more frequently, and those inspections are way more rigorous than what you and I with our regular vehicles are used to.
Which makes sense, right? Because, like, the potential for damage with something that large is just so much greater.
Absolutely.
So it makes sense that it would be that much more strict. So it's not even just about, like, oh, you need a commercial driver's license.
Right.
It's about making sure that the vehicle itself is also, like, up to par.
Absolutely. And it goes beyond just passing those inspections, too. So the Act is really big on record keeping. So these commercial drivers, the operators, they have to keep detailed logs of the vehicle's maintenance history, inspection history.
Oh, so no fudging those maintenance laws.
No.
Okay. So it seems like there's a lot more responsibility that falls on the shoulders of those commercial drivers and operators.
For sure. And the Act even talks about, like, a shared responsibility for safety. So it's not just on the driver, right? Like companies have a legal obligation to make sure that their drivers are properly trained, that they're licensed, and that they're following all these regulations.
So it's not just the driver who needs to know all this.
Exactly, yeah. The act recognizes that companies, they have a big influence on driver behavior, right? And they can actually face penalties themselves if their drivers commit violations, even if the company wasn't directly involved.
So that whole like rogue driver excuse, that doesn't really fly in court.
No, not so much.
That's good to know.
Yeah.
There's accountability at every level, especially when it comes to these big commercial vehicles.
Mm.
But we've talked a lot about like the what of the act.
Right.
Let's talk about the why.
Okay.
What do all of these rules and regulations tell us about like the values and priorities that this act is trying to reflect?
That's a good question. I think at its core, the Traffic Safety Act is all about safety,
Right.
responsibility and accountability on Alberta's roads. You know, it recognizes that driving, it's not a right, it's a privilege.
Yeah.
And with that privilege comes the responsibility to understand and follow these rules. And it's not just about you, it's about everybody else who's out there on the road too, right?
Yeah, it's about being part of a larger system and knowing that the things we do when we're behind the wheel actually like impact other people.
For sure.
But let's be real. Sometimes mistakes happen.
Of course.
Even if you have the best of intentions, we're all human. What happens when those rules are broken?
Right.
We know there are fines, but what other consequences can drivers potentially face?
Well, fines are definitely on the table, and the amount can vary, depending on what you did, how serious it was.
Right.
But the act can be pretty serious too. Like we're talking license suspensions, your vehicle could be seized. And in the most serious cases, we could even be talking jail time.
Jail time for a traffic violation.
It sounds extreme, but it is there for the very serious stuff, right?
Yeah.
So like driving under the influence, especially if somebody gets hurt, or causing an accident because of really reckless driving or dangerous driving. So the goal is to deter people from making those kinds of mistakes again, right? It's really about making sure that the roads are safe for everybody.
So it definitely sends a message, right? Like, hey, we're serious about this.
Yes.
Okay. But let's back up to those fines for a second, because I think there's a misconception about where that money actually goes.
Oh, yeah.
So when somebody gets a ticket and they pay it, where does that money go?
Right. It not quite as simple as like all the money goes into, like this big government pot or whatever.
Yeah.
The act actually specifies different things depending on who gives you that ticket,
Oh, okay.
So like, are we talking about the RCMP? Are we talking about like your local police? Like there are differences there.
So it doesn't all go towards like building new highways.
Not necessarily. So fines that are collected by, let's say, municipal police officers, like your city police, for example, that often goes right back to that municipality.
Okay. So that money's actually getting reinvested back into the community where the offense actually occurred.
Exactly. Yeah. It's about holding people accountable at a local level and then using that money, ideally, to make things better in those communities.
That's a perspective I actually had never considered before.
Yeah.
Okay. But what about those more serious penalties?
Right.
Like license suspensions, vehicle seizures, all that stuff. Is that handled differently?
Those are usually imposed either by the courts or by the Registrar of Motor Vehicle Services, depending on how serious the offense is.
Okay.
So if you get your license suspended, that basically means that you are legally barred from driving for a certain period of time.
Right.
Again, it'll depend on what you did, how long.
And those vehicle seizures we hear about, how does that actually work here?
So that's usually reserved for the more serious offenses, right?
Yeah.
So impaired driving, excessive speeding, driving without insurance, things like that.
Right.
And basically, they take your vehicle, they tow it to an impound lot, and it can be very expensive to get it back. Like there are fees, and the longer it sits there, the more it's going to cost you.
Ouch. Yeah, that's definitely an expensive lesson to learn.
Yeah.
But I've also heard that in some cases, like the government can actually just take the vehicle.
Yeah. So if your vehicle is deemed to be unfit for the road, so maybe there are some serious safety defects, maybe you've done some modifications that make it unsafe, then yeah, they have the power to do that.
Wow. So they really do have tools in place to deal with, like to keep those roads safe.
For sure.
Okay. Well, we've covered a lot of ground here, going from those minor traffic violations to stuff that can land you in some serious hot water.
But there is still so much more to unpack within this act.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
It really is like
Yeah.
peeling back the layers of an onion. There's always something else to uncover,
And speaking of uncovering, we touched on accidents a bit,
right?
but let's like really get into the nitty-gritty of reporting them, because I think that's another one of those things where it's like, when is it necessary to actually like file that formal report? When do I have to get the authorities involved? Yeah. It's a really common question I get. Most people understand that. Like, if you have a fender bender, you exchange information. But the act does lay out specific situations where, like, you need to actually go beyond that. So basically, if there's any injury, like at all, even a minor injury,
Oh, okay.
or if the damage from the accident is more than $2,000, in those cases, you have to submit a written report.
So it's not even just about like how damaged the cars are,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
If it's a super minor accident, but like someone bumped their head or something,
Yeah.
that triggers a whole other set of rules.
Exactly, because again, like the well-being of the people involved is the most important thing.
Right.
And that report, it's not really about like, oh, who's to blame?
Right.
Like it's more about it gives them information that they can use to, make decisions about road safety and like maybe prevent accidents from happening in the future.
Yeah. It's all about learning from these incidents, even the ones that like on the surface don't seem that major.
Right.
Okay. What about those like hit and run situations?
Oh, yeah.
Those have to be taken pretty seriously by the act, right?
Big time. Yeah. So leaving the scene of an accident, especially if there's an injury, that's a major offense and it can have really serious consequences. Like
Yeah.
we're talking potential fines, they could suspend your license, you could even go to jail. So it's really important to, even if you're in a really stressful situation, like take those moments after an accident seriously.
Yeah, it's like that reminder that you have to kind of like take a breath and be like, okay, this is serious. I have to do the right thing.
Yeah. It is super important no matter what the circumstances.
Absolutely. And it's not even just about like, hey, if you're the one in the accident, right?
Right, right.
The act also expects something of you, even if you're just a bystander.
Yeah, so you do have a bit of responsibility there as a witness.
Mhm.
So the act actually calls it rendering reasonable assistance.
Okay.
So that could be a lot of things. It could be as simple as calling 911. It could be providing first aid if you're able to, or even just like, directing traffic until help arrives.
Oh, okay. So you don't necessarily have to like jump in and start playing doctor on
Yeah.
the side of the road.
No, not unless you're qualified, of course.
You're qualified, but there are definitely things that like anybody can do that might be helpful in those situations.
Yeah, that's actually really reassuring that
Yeah.
the act kind of encourages people to like have that sense of community and like, we all got to look out for each other.
Yeah, for sure.
Okay. But let's move from like accidents to something a little bit more, I don't know, technical maybe.
Okay.
Vehicle modifications. Like those tricked out cars, they've got all the bells and whistles.
Yeah.
Does the act have anything to say about that kind of stuff?
Oh, yeah, big time.
Yeah.
There's a whole section on vehicle equipment standards.
Okay.
We're talking everything from brakes and tires to like your lights, those fancy high-tech safety systems.
Right.
It's got to be there and it's got to be working. So like if my brake light's out or, my tires are looking a little bald,
That could be an issue.
I could be facing a ticket.
You could, yeah. Peace officers are allowed to inspect vehicles and they can give you a ticket for any violations. And it can even be worse than a ticket. Like if they think your car is really unsafe, they can actually deem it unfit for the road.
Oh, okay. So no driving around in a vehicle that's held together by duct tape and hope.
Probably not a good idea, no. And it goes beyond the mechanics too, right? So the act talks about things like noise pollution.
Oh, okay. Noise pollution.
Yeah.
Are we talking about, like, those cars with the mufflers that sound like a herd of elephants?
Exactly, yeah. So if your vehicle exceeds those permissible noise levels, it can lead to fines. They could even seize your car.
Wow.
So again, it's about respecting the community, right?
Yeah.
Everybody's got a right to a little bit of peace and quiet.
Because nobody needs to be woken up by, like, a car that sounds like it's ready for the racetrack at 3 a.m.
Yeah.
But what about the modifications that are more about, like, how the car looks?
Right.
Like tinted windows, aftermarket lights, stuff like that.
Yeah.
Is that regulated too?
It is, yeah. The Act's got rules about things like how dark your window tint can be, what kind of aftermarket lights you can have, where they can be placed on the vehicle,
Okay.
bumper height, tire size, that kind of thing.
So if you're going to trick out your car, like, best to check the rule book first.
Yeah, definitely do your research because, again, these rules, it's about making sure the vehicles that are on the road are safe and compliant, right?
Right.
They're not going to put anybody else at risk, no matter how cool they might look.
Safety first, kids. Okay, But with all these rules and regulations, I'm imagining there are times when things get a little bit murky,
Right.
like disagreements over tickets. Maybe somebody feels like they've been treated unfairly by a law enforcement officer.
Yeah.
What happens then?
Yeah. That's where the Act has this whole process for appeals and reviews.
Oh, okay.
So if you get a ticket and you think it's BS or you feel like, something's not right, you've been penalized unfairly, you do have the right to challenge that.
So it's not like the movies where it's just
Yeah.
like you plead your case to the officer on the side of the road and hope for the best.
Yeah, it's a little more formal than that.
Okay.
So the Act lays out a formal process. There are timelines, there are procedures, you got to file your appeal in a certain way. And, just ignoring a ticket or not showing up in court, that can backfire big time.
So you got to take it seriously?
Absolutely, yeah. Take those deadlines seriously, understand the right way to do it.
Yeah. Okay, but those appeals, they're not just for traffic tickets, are they?
No. So you can actually appeal decisions made by the Registrar of Motor Vehicle Services. So that could be something like, a license suspension or a vehicle seizure, if you think that decision was unfair, or maybe it was based on wrong information. You've got some recourse.
It's good to know that those systems are in place to make sure that everything is fair.
Right.
Okay.
Eh.
But what about the really nuanced situations?
Okay.
Not about a specific ticket or a penalty, but maybe it's more about how do you interpret the act itself?
Right.
Who gets to decide what those gray areas actually mean?
Well, when it comes down to it, it's the courts that make the final decision on how to interpret the act.
Okay.
So if there's some kind of dispute about, how a certain section should be used in a certain case, it's up to the courts to figure it out.
So they're like the referees, in a way.
Exactly, yeah.
Making sure everyone's playing by the same rules.
Yep.
That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
Okay, so the act might be the rule book.
Right.
Right?
Right.
But it has to be able to roll with the punches a little bit.
Right.
It's got to adapt to the real world. It's a living document in a way.
Exactly. Yeah, it provides the framework, but it is meant to be flexible. You think about, technology is always changing, right?
Right.
And so the act has to be able to respond to those changes.
It's actually really interesting to see how much thought goes into making a system that can actually keep up with those changes, because it's not easy.
No.
Okay. But with all this talk about laws and regulations and you will get a ticket if you do this,
Right.
it's easy to lose sight of the bigger picture a bit. So what does all this mean for me, an everyday driver, just trying to get around Alberta?
I would say this act, it's about more than just following rules so you don't get in trouble. It really reflects the values that we share as a society.
Values. That's a really interesting way to put it. What do you mean by that?
Well, think about it. Safety is a value, right? We value responsibility, accountability, and the act shows that driving isn't just a right, it's a privilege.
Right.
And it's privilege that comes with certain responsibilities. You've got to understand the rules, you've got to follow them, and it's not just about keeping you safe, but everybody else out on those roads with you.
It's about acknowledging that we're all in it together.
Exactly. Yeah, okay.
But let's be real, keeping up with all these rules, it can be tough, right?
Yeah,
Especially because they change.
they do. Yeah.
What advice would you give to drivers who want to make sure that they are staying informed and not making those mistakes that could cost them?
Well, the good news is that there are tons of resources out there. So the Alberta government website has a ton of information on the Traffic Safety Act. You can find the whole act on there.
Oh, wow.
And then, of course, there are summaries that explain, the key stuff in plain English. They even have frequently asked questions.
Oh, okay. So I don't have to go full on law school just to figure this out.
No, you don't have to become a lawyer.
Perfect. And I'm imagining online or even apps on your phone probably.
Oh, for sure. Yeah, a lot of reputable organizations, even some driving schools, they'll have resources online. Some of them have apps
Okay.
that can help you stay up to date.
Yeah, because knowledge is power. Especially when you're dealing with, rules of the road.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah.
But even beyond those really practical resources,
Right.
I feel like there needs to be a little bit of a mindset shift too, right?
Right.
What would you say is the biggest takeaway that you hope people are getting from this deep dive that we're doing into the Traffic Safety Act?
Well, I would say it's about being proactive, right?
Yeah.
So not just, okay, how do I avoid a ticket?
Right.
But really thinking about safety first on the roads. The act, it's not there to restrict you, right? It's more like it's there to try to make the roads safer for everybody.
Right. It's about creating a culture where everybody feels safe.
Exactly. Exactly.
Awesome. Well, we've covered so much ground today, like really digging into the ins and outs of this act.
We really have. Yeah.
Those little nuances, like what even is a highway?
Right.
To like those weird power dynamics between the different levels of government.
Yeah, it's fascinating, isn't it?
There's a lot to it.
And those court decisions that we talked about,
right.
That was something I really had never considered before. But it impacts how the act is actually used day to day.
It does.
It's not just this like static thing that sits on a shelf somewhere.
Right.
It's out there in the world.
Absolutely. It's a living document, as you said.
And for me, the coolest thing has been uncovering the why behind the rules, right? Because we just do them.
Right.
But we don't actually stop to think about why.
Exactly, yeah. And I think that's what I hope people take away from this, right? It's like we all share the responsibility for making the roads safer.
Because at the end of the day, we all have a role to play in creating that culture of safety and accountability. So, to everyone listening, stay informed, stay engaged, and stay curious about those rules that are really shaping the way we move around out there. Until next time, drive safe.
It's really amazing how the act can, like, adapt over time, especially with things that, like, nobody could have predicted when they were first writing these rules. Okay, now that is interesting. Give me an example of the act having to, like, play catch-up with the real world.
Well, think about, like, the rise of ride-sharing.
Right, yeah.
Uber, Lyft, all that.
Right.
Like, these weren't your traditional taxis, right?
Right.
But they weren't just, like, a friend giving you a ride either.
Right. They were in this weird gray area.
Exactly. And so suddenly it's like, okay, how do we regulate this? Like, do these drivers need special licenses?
Right.
What about insurance? Like, is everybody covered?
Yeah, it really threw a wrench into things.
Totally. And those were all things that the act, like, it didn't specifically address because it wasn't a thing yet.
Right. So they have to constantly be like, okay, well now, how do we adjust?
Yeah.
How do we make sure that this all still makes sense with this new technology, this new way that people are moving around?
Exactly. And I think it really speaks to how flexible the act is because it can be updated, right? They can amend it to, like, keep up with those changes. But it's not just about like reacting to new things. It's also about trying to be proactive and figure out like, okay, how can we prevent problems down the line?
Right. And to do that, you need to get information from a whole bunch of places.
Absolutely.
It's not just like lawmakers sitting in a room going, well, I think this is how it should be.
Right. You need public feedback for sure.
Okay.
And then, of course, input from, law enforcement,
right,
transportation experts, people who are actually out there like dealing with these rules every day.
Right. It's about finding that balance between like people's individual freedom, but also like keeping everybody safe. Right?
Yeah, it's that collective responsibility.
Sure.
Finding those solutions that work for everybody.
It's like this constant work in progress, which is pretty cool when you think about it.
It is.
Yeah, bro. Okay. Well, we've covered a ton of ground here today. We really got into like the nitty-gritty of Alberta's Traffic Safety Act.
We did.
Like, even for me, I learned so much.
I'm glad.
From understanding what actually makes a highway to all those court decisions to like how much power our local governments really have.
Yeah.
There's just so much to it that like I feel like most of us don't even think about.
And that's the thing, right? Like we get behind the wheel, we kind of just like, we do our thing.
We just go.
We don't think about all the stuff that goes on behind the scenes to make it all work.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And honestly, I think my favorite part has been like going beyond just the what and figuring out the why, right?
Yes.
Like, why are these rules even in place? What are they trying to do?
It shouldn't just be a mystery, right?
Right.
There are reasons for these things.
And once you understand those reasons, it's like it makes so much more sense.
It does. And you're more likely to follow the rules if you understand why they're there in the first place, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So, yeah, to everybody listening, stay informed. Keep asking those questions. Don't be afraid to dig a little deeper into, like, the why behind the rules.
Exactly, because knowledge is power.
Exactly. Until next time, everybody, drive safe.
Drive safe.